Madam President, thank you. First of all, thank you for your flexibility at the chair today. And the purpose for me rising today is to advocate on behalf of our military, the men and women, the bravest in the world. And I feel compelled to do so because I can imagine that these days of hyper-partisan politics, some of them may feel like some of us are abandoning them, and I want them to know for sure that we are not. You know, we all took an oath to the Constitution. And the highest priority in the Constitution for the federal government is, of course, to provide for the nation's defense against all enemies, foreign and domestic. Unfortunately, Madam President, my Democratic colleagues seem to be shirking from this responsibility lately. They're willing to settle for seemingly mediocrity. And right now we have excellence, the best. First of all, they're planning to come to this chamber tomorrow to block the all-important Defense Appropriations Bill. That is to say, block the funding for our military. That is to say, to block the largest pay increase for the men and women of our military in over a decade, just to name one topic that is being funded or would be funded by this appropriations bill that they're going to block. Back in July, the House and the Senate, on a bipartisan basis, Madam President, you just gave a wonderful speech about the importance of working together. On a bipartisan basis, we passed a major budget deal. It was a win for our military, a win for our country, because it was supposed to provide them with certainty and an important path forward as they chart that path, that strategic path for America's superiority. To echo the House Speaker and the Democratic leader at the time, a bipartisan agreement has been reached that will, quote, enhance our national security. These aren't my words, although I agree with them. These are the words of the Democratic leadership of Congress. After passage, the Democratic leader went on to say this deal would, quote, strengthen our national security and provide our troops with the resources they need. I agree with the Democratic leader. Please change course while you still can and support this important funding bill tomorrow. I agreed with my colleague from New York then, and I supported that legislation for the exact reason to, quote, strengthen our national security and provide our troops with the resources they need. This deal passed with strong bipartisan support, was widely applauded, and yet here we are today, this week, with our colleagues preparing to block the funding for our troops that they were just a couple of months ago patting themselves on the back for. This whole process shouldn't even be this complicated. In fact, I'm convinced that the American people are tired of us complicating simple things. We agreed to this two-year budget agreement just a few months ago. I voted for it. Party leadership pushed for it. The president signed it. Then we voted for a short-term continuing resolution to get in order before getting to the final appropriations deal. Now, I reluctantly voted for the short-term CR. But the only thing worse than a CR is, of course, a government shutdown. So that was what we were confronted with. But if one asked the military community how they feel about continuing resolutions, they'd be quick to tell you that they don't work. They don't work at all. They provide not certainty but uncertainty. They don't allow new programs to be launched. They don't allow the pay increases that our appropriations bill does. So it's not been a priority, evidently, for our Democratic colleagues. But they do have priorities, as we know. I mean, this impeachment craziness, this obsession with eliminating, getting rid of our commander-in-chief a year before the election of the commander-in-chief is what their priorities are, clearly, not the priorities stated in the Constitution or that they were bragging about a couple of months ago. In addition, they are now standing in the way of us passing a reconciled National Defense Authorization Act, the authorization that provides the guidance for these priorities that are also part of our appropriations bill. We went through all that. And for what? I didn't agree to the deals that we made or take these tough votes just so the Democrats could block defense appropriations and leave our military stuck with political gridlock that they've imposed on us now. So, by failing to pass this appropriations bill, by standing in the way now of reconciling in conference committee the National Defense Authorization Act, they really are standing in the way of our military. And now there's talk of a, quote, skinny NDAA. That is to say, a watered-down, skinny version. For 58 years in a row, Madam President, we've done what you just talked about, what the previous speakers talked about. We've worked in a bipartisan way to pass an NDAA. 58 years in a row. As the first North Dakotan ever to sit on the Senate Armed Services Committee, I treated this NDAA with the utmost importance, and still do. We made some significant progress, from nuclear deterrence to UAS development, establishing a Space Force, and honoring the sailors of the USS Frank E. Evans, a provision that the Democratic leader and his colleague from New York supported, I'll add. Both the House and Senate versions of the NDAA advance important policies for my state and for our country and really for the world. We should be working collaboratively to combine these versions and pass the best plan possible for our military. Instead, our work is being sacrificed at the altar of partisan politics, caught up in a partisan impeachment process that makes no sense. Now let's make something clear about this skinny NDAA. Our chairman is not introducing it with haste or without great consideration. He first warned that this could happen well over a month ago. He said it would happen if our Democratic colleagues proved to be so incapable of setting aside their problems with President Trump that they could not advance the interests of our nation's military. And ever the optimist, I thought they would. I thought they would, Madam Chair. But now my Democratic colleagues are balking at any and all forward progress on the NDAA because of their opposition to President Trump and his priorities for border security. They want to limit his authority to transfer any more funds in order to build physical barriers at our southern border. So I want to be clear. The President would not need to use that authority, use any military construction funds to build the wall, if our Democratic colleagues would simply provide the necessary funding through the normal appropriations process, as they always have, as we always have. And I, for one, will not be so unreasonable in negotiating with them. For example, if, and I mean only if, my Democratic colleagues would fund the administration's border security request through the appropriations process, then count me in for limiting the President's transfer authority. I'm willing to compromise. But you can't have it both ways. You can't say we're going to take away the President's constitutional authority on the one hand, and then on the other hand, make sure that you don't fund the priorities that he needs to fund, which is, again, the highest priority of our government. To reiterate my earlier point, I applaud the Chairman for his handling of this process. He's been vigilant and focused on completing the NDAA, and I don't blame him for where we are today. No, House Democrats have not been willing partners and have forced the Chairman to devise a backup plan for their intransigence. And that is what I find so disappointing. Surely, Madam President, our Democratic colleagues know the threat that our foreign adversaries pose. For crying out loud, we just came from a classified briefing. If it's not clear enough yet, I don't know when it will be. And whether it's the crisis at the southern border or the critical missions that bring terrorists like al-Baghdadi to justice, I'm sure my colleagues want to do whatever it takes to keep our country safe. Surely they are capable of putting partisan politics aside in order to pass the 59th straight National Defense Authorization Act. Anything to the contrary would be unprecedented, Madam President. And yet here we are. And I find it astonishing that with all the wannabe commanders-in-chief right here in the Senate, they are playing politics with the funding and authorities of the troops that they hope to lead. Can you imagine one of these presidential candidates becoming the commander-in-chief and the first talk they have with the troops is, yeah, I held up your funding, your pay raises. Not a great way to start. If it were up to our committee, this bill would have already passed. If it were up to our conference, this NDAA would be on its way to the President's desk, but unfortunately it's not. Madam President, that is the unfortunate reality we face today. The Democratic Party is continuing to put their hatred of President Trump and his agenda above the needs of our nation's military and thus our nation's defense. It's a dereliction of duty. I find it sickening, and I find it embarrassing. We are better than this. This institution deserves better than this. The American people expect and deserve better than this. And I want to make one last plea before they block tomorrow's vote. Please put our military men and women, our highest priority, ahead of partisan politics. I yield the floor and note the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.